Welcome back. We're about to implement launch functionality into our API. Let's build our backend to respond accordingly when we're ready to launch our mission. Starting with our chart that tells us the create, read, update, and delete operations that we can perform using our HTTP verbs or methods to create a launch, we're going to be posting to our launches collection. This will let us create a launch that is scheduled for some date in the future. Our endpoint is going to be specific and return a 201 response if the creation of that new launch was successful. And we'll then be able to get that launches collection and see the newly created launch. Sounds good? Let's jump into our code. We can take two approaches here. In our server's source code, we could start at the launches router and work our way through the controller and into the model. Or we could take this bottom-up approach where we start with the most specific details about our model and then build up into the more general controllers and routers. So bottom-up means that we're starting at the base of our functionality, the data model, which is the foundation upon which all of the rest of our functionality is built. Let's start with the launches model. We already have a pretty good idea of what data we need to track. So starting here will give us a lot of clarity on what our controllers and routers will finally need to do. Basically, we need to write a function that our router can use to set our launches in our launches map. So let's create a function, add new launch, and we'll accept a launch as an argument, which will be the launch that we add to our collection, to our map, using the launches.set function, just like we have when we populate our example from when we were testing our getAllLaunches function. So that's a good starting point. Given a launches flight number, which we'll find at this flight number property on our launch object, we want to set the launch at that key based on the flight number to the launch that we're creating. But we want our API to be really friendly to use. It'll be difficult for the client to keep track of what the next flight number for the next possible launch should be. Basically, we want to start at the last flight number and increase it by 1 every time. And the last flight number is a piece of data that lives in the server. So why should the client send it to us when creating new launches, when scheduling those interstellar missions? What we'll do is we'll add some state to our server in this variable, which will say let latest flight number, and that will always be equal to the last flight number that was scheduled. So in our case, we have this one launch with flight number 100, so our latest flight number is exactly that. Now, in our add new launch function, we want to increase the latest flight number by 1, so we can use latest flight number plus equals 1, or just plus plus for short. And now we'll use that latest flight number as the key for our new launch. But we still want to track that flight number in our launch data so that it's returned from our API when we send back all of the values in our map. So if we're saying that this launch won't contain a flight number because it's being set on the server side here, we need to add it to this launch object. So what we'll do is, using the built-in object.assign function, we'll take our launch and we'll assign some additional properties to it. Whatever properties we have on this object that we pass in as the second argument. And if any properties are in both the launch and the new object, the new object will overwrite the old properties in the launch. Let me format this a little bit nicer so you can see what I mean. So we're setting the flight number as the key for this launch that we create in this part of our code right here, which just takes the launch that we got from the user that's getting passed down all the way into our model over here, and we're adding a flight number property that's set to the latest flight number, so that when we get the launches, all of our data is still being tracked. And object.assign will return a new object with the properties from the launch as well as the flight number correctly set. All right, so let's look at our example launch here and think about what the minimal set of data that the client, that the front end, needs to send us to create a new launch. They don't need to send us the flight number. That's something we can calculate. The mission is one of the input fields in our mission control dashboard, so we definitely need to include that. The same applies to our rocket, as well as the scheduled launch date. And we also have the destination exoplanet in our dropdown. But this customer list, well, let's just say that for launches created by our mission control dashboard, our customers are always going to be, let's see, we'll set our customers as 0 to mastery in collaboration with NASA. And more importantly, we know that when we're scheduling a new launch, it's always going to be an upcoming launch because we restrict our launch date to be sometime in the future. It wouldn't make sense to schedule past launches, right? So we'll also say that upcoming is always true for our new launches until we set it to false once that launch actually happens. And we're optimists, right? So we're going to say that unless something goes wrong, our mission starts off as a success. And we can set it to false if something goes wrong. So now we've saved our client from having to send us all of this data that can be determined on the server side. The user only needs to send us these 4 fields that make our mission unique. Okay, so it looks like our add new launch function is setting the flight number, and then between the data passed in through the API and these extra fields we're setting, everything seems to be covered, so we can export add new launch. Here we go. Before we dive into the controller, let's build an example create new launch request in Postman. By looking at what the user will be sending us, we'll have a better idea of how we need to handle the incoming request. So I'm going to duplicate this get launches request, and I'll rename it to post/launches. And of course, we need to change the HTTP method to post. In the body tab here, we'll set our body to raw and specifically the application/JSON content type. So once we click this, notice that our headers now have content type application/JSON, which means that in our body, we can pass in our launch as a JSON object. What were those 4 fields again? We need to set a mission, which we'll name, say, 0 to mastery 155. And the rocket that we'll be using is going to be this 0 to mastery experimental interstellar rocket, version 1. All right, and we'll be targeting, so the destination for our mission, destination with a T, will be, say, Kepler-186f. And last but very much not least, we need to set the launch date when our experimental rocket will fly off towards Kepler-186. And our date, well, it could take a variety of different formats. We could pass in a number representing the amount of milliseconds since January 1st, 1970. That would be what's called the Unix time format. Or we could pass in a string using any number of formats. Say we're being really explicit and we want to say January 17th, 2030. Dates might sound like a small little detail, but if you've ever worked on some piece of code that does scheduling or works with time zones, you'll know that it's actually one of the most difficult things that we do as software developers. So our controller is going to need to be smart when we handle this launch date. But for now, that looks like a good set of data. So we'll save this, and our goal is going to be for this request to succeed. We'll start by taking a look at the launches controller in the next video. Let's take a short break and keep this one going. I'll see you soon.